Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Inside Out Alignment Show, episode number 1. We've got Mary McNeill with us. Mary, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much.
Great. So Inside Out Alignment, what is that? So Inside Out Alignment is a program I developed, and it really talks about mindset, which is the inside, paired with skills and behavior, which is the outside. And when those are aligned, you help become a better version of yourself. And so that's what Inside Out Alignment is. So Mary, you want to tell us who you are?
Sure. My name is Mary McNeill. I'm a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator, and I have a double master's in health education and MBA.
Awesome. And I've known Mary for the better part of a decade plus, and I can tell you what I love about Mary is not only is she wicked smart and experienced in this area of weight management and diabetes, she's very relatable. People really enjoy her personality, and she really is good at getting the best out of others. So in terms of your area of expertise and kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis, Mary, where do you spend most of your time and with your patients?
Well, a love of my career has been working with the world of diabetes. And that led me to enter the world of bariatrics and helping people with bariatric surgery. The two are actually very related. The surgery is actually now considered the cure for type 2 diabetes. So I've enjoyed this. That has then led me to really helping people heal all throughout their body. So I focus on the whole body, but specifically my specialty is diabetes and bariatrics.
Okay, great. So let's maybe start with that framework. So what is diabetes?
Diabetes is a condition where you're not able to use your insulin effectively. You may be still making plenty of insulin, as in the case of type 2 diabetes, but you're not utilizing it correctly.
All right. And so let's talk about some of the components of diabetes. So let's start with glucose. Why don't you tell us what glucose is?
Okay, so what happens is there is a sugar in our body that we use for energy, and it's called glucose. And when they measure your blood sugar levels, what they're really measuring is your blood glucose levels. This is the fuel for our body. But glucose cannot just go into the cell by itself. It needs a helper, a hormone called insulin.
Right. So that kind of brings into the next question. But before we go to that, so typically glucose gets in the body how? Through what kinds of foods typically?
Oh, typically through the carbohydrate foods. But in the absence of carbohydrate foods, the body can take any food and any fuel, such as fat stores, and convert it back into glucose.
Got it.
That happens at night when we're asleep and we've been several hours without eating.
Got it. So we eat these carbohydrates, blood glucose spikes, insulin is released to get into the bloodstream. So maybe tell us a little bit about insulin and how it works in the body.
Okay, insulin is released by the pancreas, and it's released in response to food. And how that happens now is a different environment than our ancestors lived in. Our ancestors truly lived in an environment of feast and famine. And during times of famine, if they didn't have the ability to store fat, they wouldn't make it. We wouldn't be here. So this ability to store fat is heralded along by insulin. Insulin will take glucose and put it into the cells that need it. But any extra glucose that we have hanging around, insulin will convert that to a form of triglycerides, and we store that as fat.
Sorry, go ahead.
Insulin saves our life because it allows us to store fat. But we live very differently now. We don't have periods of famine, at least not yet. Okay, so we also have gone from when I was a young person coming up, we ate usually at 7 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and 5 o'clock. There were no snacks around. And now it's not uncommon for people to start eating at 7 o'clock in the morning, get a snack at 9, eat at lunch, get a snack at 3, eat at 6, get a snack before they go to bed. And so we've changed our window of time that we're not eating dramatically in just my lifetime. If you're eating carbohydrates, it basically tells insulin, yes, I'm ready to store fat. Yes, I'm ready to store fat. Yes, I'm ready to store fat, instead of allowing the body to come back to baseline.
That's great. Super helpful. So let's also talk about cortisol. So there's kind of like a three-headed monster, if you will, when glucose, insulin, and cortisol. So tell us how cortisol, what is cortisol, and how does it play into this whole glucose insulin response in the body?
Sure. Cortisol is also critically important today. It is a hormone that's produced by the body in response to either physical or emotional distress. So I'm sure nobody out there has a stressful lifestyle. We all do. And what cortisol does is it forces the release of glucose back into the body. And then if there's excessive glucose, insulin grabs it and stores it as fat. And it specifically, cortisol tends to store belly fat.
So what's really interesting here is, we talk about biology and our history, and over the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, our system was designed to work in that feast or famine and fat storage kind of model. And yet here we are in 2022. And when I hear you speak about this idea of always having food available, and always snacking, and I think there were periods of time, and maybe even today, many doctors and nutritionists will tell you to always eat every couple hours to keep your blood sugar levels stable. And, that's really almost misinformation and kind of dated information. So you can talk a little bit about that idea of having to eat as soon as you get up and eat consistently throughout the day until you go to sleep.
Okay. First of all, we wouldn't have survived because we wouldn't be able to run from prey. Okay. So a part of that advice depends on what you're eating. Okay. In my profession, especially, dietitians tend to eat healthy. And there's sometimes an assumption that the whole world does too, not realizing that it's Starbucks for breakfast and, or some type of creamy high fat milkshake that has coffee flavor in it. They are assuming that you're having something maybe a little bit different, and not the kinds of snacks that we tend to rely on, the kinds of meals we tend to rely on. So if you're going to give the advice to eat every 2 hours, which first of all, I think is wrong. Okay. Unless there's a medication or some reason you have to. And if you have to eat every couple of hours, then I think you need to speak to a registered dietitian and get some advice on exactly what that looks like.
Yeah. So as you talk about cortisol, which is like the fight or flight response, I think it's really interesting. We live in 2022 where food is readily available and we mostly consume it ad nauseum all day long. And yet stress is also, this kind of covert stress, this not kind of call it fight or flight, but just the daily stress of our lives. It's like we have all this access to stress and food. So you can imagine how hard it is for people to keep weight at a desired level when you've got constant availability of food and basically low level constant stress, which is encouraging the body to do what? Store everything we eat as fat.
I just wanted to add one thing. Okay. If we lived in this country 200 years ago, we would have stress. Okay. Between the wild animals, the wars, the crop didn't come in, food wasn't available, something happened, there was stress in those times. The difference was there wasn't food to go with it.
Right.
Okay. And so we released cortisol. If we had food, we would put on a little fat. Winter would come. We didn't have food anymore. We'd lose the fat.
Very different world we live in today.
Very different. Yeah. Well, it used to be the average man had to gain 30 pounds to survive the winter. If he didn't gain 30 pounds, then he would lose 30 pounds. Right. And maybe, the average weight of a man back then was 140 pounds. So at 110 pounds, a lot of the men didn't make it.
Yeah, it's so interesting to just think about the history of our lives, and we are just in a little speck of grain in time, yet we think our systems should be fully adapted to, our environment of food and stress. So with all of that in mind, let's transition to a couple of other hormones that we know play into satiety, hunger, and how that fat storage works. And the first one's going to be leptin. So tell us what leptin is and how it works in the body.
Okay, if you were to look at your stomach and fill it with food, when you got to the top of the stomach where it begins to stretch a little, the stomach releases a hormone called leptin. Leptin says you have had enough to eat, stop. Okay, and by the way, fullness should be a very comfortable thing. Fullness should not be a pain because it's stretched and you ate too much. Right. Okay, that's overfull. Okay, so fullness is actually a lack of hunger. Okay, more so than, oh, that hurt. I must have eaten too much. You ate way too much if you're feeling it. Okay, so leptin is normally there to tell us that we've had enough to eat. But in the presence of elevated insulin levels, it will keep trying to get the signal through, and that signal is blocked. So a lot of my patients tell me, I stopped eating because I ran out of food, or I don't know what it feels like to be full. And they're telling the truth. Okay, they don't know. They've lost that ability. And it's due to the resistance of the insulin. And
this, just to clarify, your patients are typically what kind of patients?
Well, the bariatric patients are all at least 100 pounds overweight.
Right.
Okay, and the diabetic patients are diabetic. But in general, they have tended to accumulate a dysregulation of all of these hormones.
Right. And we're going to talk about that on the back end of these other two hormones. We're going to talk about ghrelin and adiponectin. So leptin is eat. I eat food. I eat enough food, signal to the brain, I'm full, stop eating. So that's leptin.
You can see this in children a lot. Children don't care if there's 4 bites of food left on their plate.
Yeah.
Okay. Adults do. Adults want to just overeat it.
All right. So let's go to the other hormone, kind of the opposite of leptin, which is full, is ghrelin. Means what? Ghrelin hormone does what?
It's time to eat.
It's time to eat. Hunger.
Make me hungry. Make me eat more than I normally could. Make me eat carbohydrates because they taste good. And insulin and ghrelin work together to stimulate your hormone and to cause you to put on fat.
Right.
So I call ghrelin the gremlin because I think it is. And I know we need it. But think about Thanksgiving when you may have had a full meal. There's no question your belly is full, right? But somebody comes along with a goodie and all of a sudden we have room for it. Okay, that's ghrelin.
Now there's another element here that's interesting, and that is kind of the delayed response for leptin to kick in. I've heard 20 minutes, 15 or 20 minutes. You need to eat until that signal goes to the brain from the vagus nerve. Hey, I'm full. Is that 20 minutes ish? Is that a myth? Is there some trick? 15 to 20
from the first bite. And by the way, if you eat fast food in America, they've timed you. Most people get fast food meals down in 11 minutes flat.
Wow. So
they've overeaten before they've even had a chance.
That's it. I was going to say, that's the catch, right? Is by the time the signal hits to your brain, oh, you're full, you're probably 500 calories past that level, right?
Yeah. It's when you're driving back out on the road again that you're like, oh, it just hit you.
Exactly.
Right?
So there's another, I mean, some takeaways from here we'll have at the end, but there's really huge value in eating slow, chewing the food, releasing the enzymes, allowing your body to do what's required. I know I'm guilty of this. I shovel food down much faster than I otherwise should.
I'll tell you what'll help. Don't drink fluid at the meal.
So great segue. Talk about that briefly, because that's going to be a topic for another podcast, but tell us a little bit about consuming liquids while you're consuming foods at the same time and how that works in the digestive tract.
Okay. So most of us eat too fast. We take a big bite and we chomp about 5 times, then swallow it. And it has to go down our little bitty esophagus. And so we get a big drink of something to help push it down the esophagus. That's not the way we're supposed to eat. Okay. There is a school of thought out there that you can also dilute stomach acids, but they've kind of said that doesn't happen now. But the big thing is you're not properly chewing your food. If you want to eat correctly, you should take small bites, no bigger than the size of your fingertips. You should chew each bite about 15 times or so. And you should wait until the end of the meal to have any fluid.
So let's go to the third hormone we talked about, and that's adiponectin. So it's a big word, but tell us what adiponectin is and how it works as it relates to food consumption and fat storage.
Okay. So adiponectin is actually released by fat tissue. And it really helps with insulin sensitivity. And it helps reverse diabetes and all kinds of things. The problem is the more fat you accumulate, the less you make of it. So indirectly, insulin is causing you to store fat. And at the same time, it blocks the signal to break down fat.
Wow.
Okay, so adiponectin, to restore adiponectin levels, low calorie diet, physical activity, and omega-3s seem to really make an impact.
Right. So we've got these 3 hormones. One is leptin, tells you you're full. Ghrelin tells you you're hungry. And adiponectin is store fat. So there's a lot of things going into play here that when they're not aligned or they're not in balance, we don't have this homeostasis, if you will, it really sets up the body to store fat, become inefficient at burning fat, and makes it tougher tomorrow to do the opposite or, make better choices. Yeah. Right. So it really, all of this is stacked against us to encourage fat storage.
So what happens with this whole appetite dysregulation is you're hungry all the time, and usually not for celery. You're usually wanting some kind of carbohydrate. You're hungry all the time. You never feel full, and you can't lose weight for anything.
Right.
Okay. And the secret to all of this is managing the insulin itself.
Right.
And in fact, when I work with people with type 2 diabetes, that's exactly what I'm focused on. I'm not going to chase blood sugars. They're going to straighten themselves out. Okay. I'm going to manage the insulin. And when you manage the insulin, funny little things start happening. All of a sudden, you're not as hungry, or you can't eat as much as you used to. People say their stomach shrinks. Well, it doesn't actually shrinks. What happened is leptin got through and told you, hey, you're full now.
Right.
And you start dropping fat. And it's because insulin is such a powerful hormone. During times of feasting, we had it there to help us survive. It's a very powerful hormone, but we can get control over this dysregulation again.
So this kind of brings us full circle. And I want to touch a little bit on the importance of delaying that weight gain process, right? So many of us on this podcast have kids. We see our kids and we know where obesity is in America, whether it's young people, it's average American, it's elderly people. Talk about some of the challenges once you get into the additional weight gain, obesity, how prediabetes kicks in, diabetes kicks in, and how it is, there is science behind why it's so challenging to reverse that.
There is. So I'm going to draw a real quick picture. I think pictures are worth 1,000 words. Okay. So if we were to look at glucose levels, okay, between 70 and 100 is considered normal.
Right.
In fact, if you go get your fasting blood work done, they'll tell you if you're between 70 and 100 that your blood work's fine. Okay. But what happens at 100 is they diagnose a condition called prediabetes. Okay.
Yep.
And prediabetes, if you kind of pull back the curtain and look at what's happening with insulin, you're still releasing lots of insulin, but the effectiveness of that insulin is dropping. Okay. So this is, they still may be producing tons of insulin, but the insulin effectiveness, the signaling percentage, its efficiency is dropping.
So
when that drops, the sugars go up.
So that's how it starts. So, there's
Yes.
a lot of, you see on TV, there's so many commercials about managing your diabetes and A1C. And I don't want to create fear or paranoia here, but I really want to talk about why it's so critical to get ahead of this as soon as you can.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a conversation a few weeks ago that spurred this topic for this podcast. I really wanted to talk about how when you become pre-diabetic and diabetic, that wall to overcome becomes higher and higher and more challenging. So the takeaway here is to try to get ahead of that, but talk a little bit about how, leptin, ghrelin, adiponectin work with pre-diabetic and diabetic patients specifically.
Okay, I want to finish this one graph and then I'll
Sure.
do it, because this is a critical part of the answer. Okay, so at 100, when you get diagnosed with pre-diabetes, which means you're on the train and it's starting to move, already 50% of your insulin cells are not signaling correctly.
Wow.
Okay, when you are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes at 125 fasting, 80% of those cells are now not working. Okay, and it only gets worse. Medication can help, but medication, you're chasing the sugars. You're still not getting what's behind it, which is the insulin resistance.
Right.
And insulin resistance causes inflammation in the body, which also brings your blood sugars up. Insulin resistance causes problems with heart disease and cholesterol and hypertension. So there's a lot of things that insulin resistance is doing in the background. And to go from pre-diabetic to diabetes is usually less than 7 years. So you're on a train and it's picking up speed. Okay. It's easier to stop the train when it was just getting started.
Yeah.
It's going to be easier to reverse where you are if you're at 100 versus 150 or 200 or 300.
Right.
Okay.
So a lot of takeaways here. And again, I want to go back to how the leptin, ghrelin, adiponectin play in for pre-diabetic and diabetic patients. But all of this taken holistically, the takeaway message is, metrics, measuring, Oura rings, always measuring, getting blood levels, baseline blood levels and glucose and insulin levels measured early in life is really important. I don't want to make that an additional topic. I just want to call out how critical it is. And people like Mary are experts in diagnosing and knowing what metrics to look at. But let's then circle back on the leptin, ghrelin, adiponectin with pre-diabetic and diabetic patients, because what you said it took my breath away with the challenges that come with pre-diabetes and diabetes as it relates to these three hormones.
Well, again, this insulin resistance has been building for a while. Chances are for the previous 15 to 20 years, you've been producing too much insulin, or the person has. They produce too much insulin because they overeat on the readily available and abundant carbohydrates we have. Okay, insulin really can't do a whole lot with protein foods, with healthy fats, and with vegetables. So I tend to think of those in the abundance column. The intentionality, the very mindful thing you have to keep your eye on is what kind of carbohydrates and how much are you having.
Right.
It's okay to have some, a small amount, let the insulin levels go up, let them come back down. But when you're eating a typical fast food meal, instead of about 30, 45 grams of carbohydrate at the meal, you might have a significantly higher number.
So the takeaway in all of this, again, we had said prior to is, the longer you wait, the longer you allow prediabetes to turn into diabetes, and then for diabetes to sustain, it makes it almost impossible or extremely challenging to reverse. So I think the takeaway here is not that we want to create fear, but that is get to someone you trust to get some baseline blood sugar, insulin levels, A1C measured, and see where you are and start having the conversation. And part of the purpose of this Inside Out Alignment show and the podcast is to educate people on this reality of what's going on. We eat these foods and we think there's no consequences. I don't feel a certain way, right? I don't feel like I'm getting sick. I don't feel like there's all this inflammation in my body. But what happens, and we've talked about this with my patients and my clients and your clients, is so much time has passed because they weren't aware. And now that hurdle is so high to overcome. So takeaway is people like Mary, someone I trust at a very high level, who's really, really talented in this area, can help educate you and do the things that are required.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
Okay, so when I talk to my patients, my challenge is I'm reversing their insulin resistance. When we get the system back in line again, the diabetes symptoms go away. Now in Canada, I can tell you we're reversing diabetes. Okay. Here in the United States, I have to say I'm reversing insulin resistance.
Right.
But there was a strong belief for many, many years that when you had this insulin signaling dysfunction, that the cells in the pancreas were gone forever. They were dead or they were damaged. Okay. They're not dead. They're not damaged. Your pancreas needs to rest. There's no other organ in the body. We wait until only 20% function is left before we start paying attention to it. Okay. But for some reason with diabetes, that's been the overriding feeling. And so I believe in catching it much, much earlier. To look at the traditional chart, 99 is normal. And when you go in next year and you're 102, well, that's not very much of a difference, but all of a sudden you're pre-diabetic and we now know 50% of your cells are not signaling right.
Yeah. And just, the idea of letting systems rest, like letting your digestive tract rest. We're going to talk about fasting in another episode, but there's so much here about, just pausing the consumption of food to let the pancreas rest, to let your digestive system rest. I think there's a lot of validity to this, but again, part of what this is about is to explain the why behind these statements of time restricted feeding, intermittent fasting. Like, what does all it mean? Like, put it in context. And I think part of what we did today is frame some of that context, right? Is there's a reason all of this correlates. So let's maybe end the podcast with some best practices. We're not here to give advice. We're not going to give here any prescriptions, but kind of high level, what are the things that, some of the people that are watching this podcast can take away that would help set them up for a little more success than they otherwise would have?
When you get your fasting glucose levels back, pay attention if it's over 85. Okay. For every milligram per deciliter above 85, there's a 6% chance relative risk, increase of 6% relative risk of developing type 2 diabetes within 6 years. Okay, so the first thing is keep an eye on your fasting glucose. Actually ask your doctor for the results. Okay, they'll give them to you.
Right.
Okay, the second thing is if you do notice there's a problem, realize the insurance world is not set up to cover it yet.
Right.
Okay, they're still waiting until you get sick.
Right.
Okay, you have to have the disease before they'll pay you for you to go see someone. Not even pre-diabetes is covered. But at pre-diabetes, 50% of your cells are not signaling. And it's easier to catch it now. It's easier to reverse it now. Okay, so even if your insurance doesn't pay for it, I would go see a medical dietitian, hopefully one that specializes in diabetes, and have them help you. There's a lot of dietitians out there in private practice. We're not that expensive. Okay.
Yep.
And the price of your health is worth so much.
Yep. And that's a whole nother conversation about what the medical system is set up to do. And that is basically treat diseases once they happen versus prevent them from happening in the first place.
Right.
topic of a whole
But
nother.
it's our money. It's our money, and we can spend it whatever way we like.
Awesome. Well, Mary,
Yeah.
that was great. I hope everybody found this of value. I am a big fan of Mary. She's educated me a lot on health and food and nutrition and hormones. Mary, how can people reach you?
The easiest way to reach me is going to be mary@maryshealthhub.com.
I want to thank you for sharing all your information for our viewers and educating me. And I'm very grateful that you are able to come on today and share all that insight.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Mary.